We're going to spend some time now looking at the book of Haggai. We've been working our way through the minor prophets, and I'm excited about spending some time in this book in particular because I think out of all the minor prophets that we've looked at so far, it might be the most obviously practical. I'm a practical guy, and Haggai is definitely a practical prophet. They're all practical when you really study them. By the end, you realize how much relevance each one of these minor prophets actually has. But this is just one of those that seems to be more obviously and immediately practical and relevant to us and where we're at today. Though I guess at first it might not seem like that, so maybe I'm wrong about the obvious relevance, but it's about a temple. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are all a little bit different than the prophets we've been reading so far, and so it's probably important to identify the role they're playing in God's great salvation plan. You remember God had chosen Abraham, and he made all these promises, and he started fulfilling these promises by rescuing his descendants out of Egypt and then bringing them into this promised land. And yet, in spite of how gracious God was, they ended up living like all the other people around them. And so God started sending these prophets who were telling them, look, if you do not listen to God, you're going to end up being kicked out of the promised land. And we've looked through a lot of what those prophets had to say already. We call them the pre-exilic prophets, before exile, like Obadiah and Joel and Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Micah and Nahum and even Jeremiah. He's kind of a transitional figure. And then you have the exilic prophets, the ones who prophesied after God's people had been taken into exile and while they were in exile, like Ezekiel and then Daniel. And then you have the post-exilic prophets, the prophets who prophesied after exile, like Haggai. Because what happened is that God told his people they would go into exile. And then while they were in exile, he told them how long that particular part of their exile would be, 70 years. And then he told them they would go back to the land, or at least some of them. And that's actually exactly what happened. I was realizing as I was preparing for Haggai that we maybe should have studied Ezra and Nehemiah before we started studying Haggai and then even Zechariah, because while we've gotten a lot of background for the exilic prophets and for the pre-exilic prophets as well from the book of Kings, the place we get some of the necessary background for Haggai and Zechariah is actually in Ezra and Nehemiah instead. Perhaps to give you a little feel of what's going on, you can read Ezra chapter 1, or at least listen to me, where it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, right there already signals the fact that a historical change has taken place. And that's important because who had defeated Judah and taken them into exile in the first place? It was Babylon. And yet, even as we're reading Habakkuk, we saw that Babylon wasn't going to be on the scene for very long. Even though they were terrifying and they were powerful, God raised up Cyrus in order to overthrow them. And that's something that Isaiah himself prophesied, actually. Isaiah 44:28, speaking of God. God says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all of my purposes, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Which must have sounded funny when Isaiah said that, because there was no Cyrus. The people were still in the land, and the temple was right there in front of them. But what happened, of course, is that just like Isaiah prophesied, they were taken out of the land. The temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And yet 70 years later, God raised up Cyrus. And Ezra tells us, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. And that's Jeremiah chapter 25. Chapter 25, verses 11 and 12 says, this whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. And the reason I'm quoting all these prophecies is just to help you get a feel of how exciting it must have been for God's people as they were watching this happen. Cyrus comes to power, just as God said he would. They could read it in the book. And then Ezra 1:1, Again, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah, which, of course, this is all so awesome. And you can imagine being the people of God at this point, because they've been through some stuff, some really hard stuff. And it might have looked at first like God had cursed them, and yet here's a pagan king who's standing up and saying, God wants me to rebuild his temple. And that's a really big deal, the temple, in terms of the overarching plan of God. Let me give you a little sense of this. Biblically speaking, there are two places. You have God's place and man's place. The place where God is and the place where man is. Now, God is God, so he's everywhere, of course, but there is a place where he is especially present. And you remember in the Bible, sometimes God's place overlaps with man's place. So there's a space where both God and man dwell. And in the beginning, that was the Garden of Eden. And God's goal was for the whole world to be like that. And man was supposed to help accomplish it by extending the borders of the Garden of Eden, really. But of course he didn't. But God didn't give up on his plan, even though man rebelled against it. And so he chose this special people, and part of his purpose was so that he could dwell with them in this unique and special way where there's a little bit of heaven on earth. And the place he did that was the tabernacle and then the temple. And you remember at the end of Exodus how it was like God moved into the tabernacle, Exodus 40. And then in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10, at the dedication of the temple, the same thing happens again, which of course is what made it such a big deal when Ezekiel said that God was going to destroy the temple. They were like, that can't be. That can't happen. Because it seemed like maybe God was giving up on his plan of filling earth with heaven. And it's what made it such a big deal when Cyrus made the proclamation he did. If you were a godly person, this was not just about rebuilding the temple. This is about God's whole plan, in a sense, getting going again. And initially, going back to Ezra, it looked really good because not only did Cyrus say he wanted to rebuild the temple, he also said, whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who's in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, which sounds, of course, a little bit like what the Egyptians did when God saved them from slavery there. You remember how Moses told them to ask the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and God gave them favor, and the Egyptians gave them whatever they asked for. And so just like God said, he's taken his people into exile, he has disciplined them, and now he's sending them back with help from pagans so they could rebuild the temple again. And there were about, I think they say there were about 50,000 Israelites who thought that was exciting, and they were willing to move back and get to work. Obviously, there were many more who were taken into exile, but what happened during those 70 years is that many of them became fairly prosperous. And so there were a lot that didn't want to go back. Why would they? And yet there were those who did for good spiritual reasons. They wanted to rebuild the temple. They wanted to be part of what God was doing there. And initially, they started off pretty well. It didn't take them very long after they had gotten back that they started laying the foundation of the temple of the Lord. And it was a huge moment for them, which we read about in Ezra chapter 3, verse 10. It says, and when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsibly, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. And yet, even though this was a great start, it wasn't long until they faced opposition. Of course, God's work always faces opposition in this world. And this opposition came from people we call the Samaritans. Some of the poor had stayed in the land during exile when the rest were taken into exile, and other people from other countries had been brought to the land, and they intermarried, and that's where Samaritans came from. And so they mingled true religion with false. And what happened was they initially came and asked if they could help rebuild the temple, but the leaders of God's people refused them, and we don't know why exactly, good or bad reasons, not sure. Maybe they knew their intentions. Maybe they knew they weren't sincere, because after they told them no, Ezra tells us, verse 4 of chapter 4, then the people of the land, that's the Samaritans, discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors against them to frustrate them all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even till the reign of Darius, king of Persia, which was about 16, 17 years in total in terms of delay. And it's there that the book of Haggai picks up. Look at Haggai 1:1. In the second year of Darius, the king, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai, the prophet, to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Now, the name Haggai means feast or festival, and that's maybe because he was born during one of Israel's feasts. And it's an appropriate name for sure, because he's going to be all about the temple. At this point, he's probably an old man. Most people think he was born during the exile, or maybe even before. And yet this is the first time he really comes into focus in the Bible. Many ancient traditions have him as the author of several psalms, like Psalm 111. But God raised up this particular man for this particular moment, and he's speaking all these years after God's people had come back into the land. And he's speaking to Zerubbabel, which literally means seed of Babylon. So Zerubbabel was born in exile, and yet he's the governor of God's people at this point, and he's an important person because he's the grandson of Jeconiah, who's a descendant of David. So this is a Davidic descendant ruling again in Jerusalem, not as king, but still ruling. And Joshua is a descendant of Zadok, so he's in the right line to be high priest. And while these are all the right men, the right things aren't happening at this point. And in particular, as a result of this opposition, the people had become distracted from doing what was most important, rebuilding the temple, which is why God raised up Haggai. And he gave Haggai 4 messages, basically, over the course of less than a year. So Haggai's ministry is focused. And Haggai is very specific about the dates, as you can see. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, which was, scholars say, August 29th, 520 BC. That's when he gets his first message. The second message comes down in chapter 2, verse 1, and this is October 17th, 520 BC. And then the third message is in verse 10, and it takes place on December 18th, 520. And then finally, one last message in verse 20 of chapter 2, which takes place on the same day, actually, December 18th, 520 BC. And those dates, those 4 messages, provide the basic structure for this book, as Haggai has to deal with several excuses the people are giving for not being serious about rebuilding the temple. In chapter 1, he deals with the excuse, it's not a good time. It's not a good time for us. And he shows the importance of putting first things first. Then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, he deals with the excuse, it doesn't seem like much. It doesn't seem that big what we're doing. And he shows them that they are actually playing a part in God's long-term plan. And then in chapter 2, verses 10 through 19, they come back and say, but it's not working. It's not working. Even though we started with the temple, it just isn't going the way we thought it would. And he talks to them about the consequences of sin, and he calls on them to persevere. And then finally, in chapter 2, verses 20 through 23, there's one more encouragement, because the temple wasn't the only issue, you know. There was the fact there was no Davidic king, and they weren't even a nation. And so the leadership might even be tempted to give the excuse, what's the point? And Haggai at that point, as we'll see, gives them a preview of where God is taking the universe. Haggai. We're going to look more closely at the book in videos to follow, but Haggai is God's man. God has raised up Haggai at this particular point in history to help God's people get back on focus. He has given them a job to do. They've become lazy in doing that job, and they have all kinds of excuses. And so God calls Haggai, this old man, to remind them and to show them why they need to stop making excuses and commit themselves to doing what God's called them to do. And I'm excited for us to look at the book and see how that message, those messages, are relevant to us still today.